Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Pratt. I'm the Peacemonger. It is Tuesday afternoon, the 3rd of March in the afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome onto the show today somebody I follow actively, but the first time I'm fortunate enough to meet him, Matthew Hoh. He's a senior fellow of the Eisenhower Media Network and a former US Marine Corps officer who served both in the Iraq War, because he looks so young, I assume that's 2003, and the Afghanistan conflict as well. In fact, is in Afghanistan the year before I was. Matthew, it's great to finally meet you.
Good to meet you, Ian. It's same thing too. I've been following you for a while, so this is really nice to be face to face here.
Thank you. Now, I keep coming back to this kind of strategic question about what Trump's trying to achieve or
Mm.
if there is a strategy in Iran, and I keep sort of coming back to this thought that he loses both ways if he plays it short or long. If he plays it, if he kind of backs off now, then he'll look weak, and if he continues, then he risks looking like a failure. And I'm struggling to find other plausible at this stage kind of scenarios. I mean, what's your take on what's going on right now?
No, they really have, Ian, put themselves into a trap here. And if you look at the statements coming from the White House, from the Defense Department, from the State Department, what's being put forward by the administration's proxies in Congress or on the media, it is jumbled. It's confused. There's no real clarity in terms of what is the outcome that they desire. You hear everything from we're doing this to liberate the people of Iran, to that old canard about nuclear weapons, to ballistic missiles, to making sure that Iran is not a threat to its neighbors, or Iran is not supporting terror groups like Hezbollah or the Houthis, right? I mean, it's just they can't settle on one thing or at least even articulate what it is that they believe will be victory, right? What it is that they can achieve that will say, okay, we're not going to fire any more missiles or send any more drones. And you see that particularly in the president's comments of these last few days. People on Twitter or on X have been, posting long posts with excerpts from all his different interactions with various newspapers, and you could see that it's really difficult to find a through line. So I think this trap, as you've explained it, of either he ends it early and he looks weak, or he keeps it going and he's stuck basically, is an accurate one because there has not been an explanation put forward publicly as to what constitutes victory in this sense. And that's because I don't think they have one.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. And when I read the national security strategy that was published, I think, gosh, was it last year now? It feels
Yeah.
like a long time ago. I read it from page to page, and it looked like something that had been drafted by a committee. It didn't really have a kind of clear thread for it. And I've heard a lot over the past year since Trump came to power, feels like a lifetime. Uh, you know, that he kind of believes in this kind of chaos theory. Keeping people guessing. It's never really been clear where he's kind of going. On Ukraine, he's never really had any kind of strategic patience for more than a day or two on any particular issue. He's chopped around different issues, and for a while, I just thought this was part of the kind of chaos theory that somewhere there's a kind of bigger
Yeah.
kind of plan. I'm not starting to doubt that. I mean, what do you think it's chaos theory, or do you just think it's just chaos?
I think it's just chaos. I think in his first administration, a lot of us said, you know what, this might be like Nixon and Kissinger's Madman theory. And people recall that was the belief by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger that if you could keep your adversary unsure of what you were going to do because you were, quote, a madman, unquote, that would make them uncertain. They would be indecisive, and then you could take advantage of those circumstances, right? So that your fake chaos, your fake madness would cause other people to lose their capacity for reason and rationale and then make mistakes that you could take advantage of. That was the madman theory. In this case, I think we really do have a madman, and we're not being exaggerative, we're not being hyperbolic. symbolic. We've all seen this now for years. And this idea that Donald Trump may post something on Truth Social, as he did, say this morning, describing that American stocks and missiles are at their highest level ever, and we could do this essentially forever if the Iranians want us to. And then, this evening we can see one saying that he's met all the objectives and we're ending this thing. I mean, so there is this reality we're dealing with of a president who is the ultimate decision maker here, who is so mercurial, so temperamental, so unmoored or unanchored in terms of having any principles or beliefs or strategic thought that we, as either analysts or the public, can look at and say, oh, I can see where this is going. I mean, I think there is a case to be made that they did have a plan, and that plan was that this is just going to be like Venezuela. So we're going to take out the senior leadership, and then the rest of the rest of the regime, the rest of the government will gladly accept our offer, right? And whoever we have to bribe or coerce or co-opt, it'll be done, and it'll be just like Venezuela. I think that was their thinking. But even that, according to the president himself, is just confounded, and just the execution of it was at least incompetent, because Donald Trump himself said a couple of days ago in one of his messages that, he basically said that was the plan, but, the guys that we were going to put in charge, we've killed them all. So the second and third level guys, we also killed. So if the plan was to do these decapitation strikes and then shift power to subordinates who were in agreement with the U.S., but then you kill those subordinates, I mean, this thing is just so cocked up, so messed up, that, it's hard to even know where to begin to express ourselves about it.
Yeah. I remember a former British ambassador, to the US, had to lose, had to leave early in Trump's first term, because he some of his confidential telegrams leaked, basically saying that Trump is so thin-skinned he doesn't listen to advice. I mean, is he the emperor with no clue? I mean, I look at JD Vance, who in many regards I respect. I mean, I sort of his Munich Security Conference speech of last year, I found myself largely in agreement with. I have to be completely honest, but that's just that's just me. I don't think he's a stupid man by any means, but I also think he's attached himself to Trump's mast because he's got one eye on the future, and I'm not sure that there are people actually kind of counseling the president, or that he's capable or susceptible to being counseled. I mean, what is your sense?
Well, Trump certainly has surrounded himself with people who are either sycophants or have been willing to become sycophants. I mean, certainly the videos are all over the internet of what Tulsi Gabbard or Pete Hegseth said about wars before they became the director of national intelligence or the secretary of war. JD Vance, very similar. And even our understanding is that last year, at least through the June 25 12-day war, JD Vance was one of the lone voices in the administration urging restraint. And then when you had the protests that occur at the end of last year, beginning of January, JD Vance is now one of those in the room with Donald Trump urging military action, urging the United States to attack Iran. So you've seen the one person last year in the cabinet who urged some degree of restraint has now abandoned all of that. And I think the explanation is that, as you said, he's got an eye on the future. And that if he displeases Donald Trump, there's no way then he's going to get Donald Trump's endorsement for 2028. And the way the system here in the United States is, particularly within the Republican Party, what we've seen is that if you want to be successful in the Republican Party in this era, you need Donald Trump's endorsement, that you are not going to, particularly on a national level, succeed without the endorsement of Donald Trump and everything he brings with him. So you have a cabinet that is entirely craven, a cabinet that is opportunistic, They, like their boss, have no principles. They have no beliefs. They have no worldview that they remain consistent with. And so, I mean, the only thing about that I would say, Ian, that is somewhat positive about that is we're not stuck with the same mindset as, say, the George W. Bush administration, which would refuse to change, right? Which would refuse to understand, take the reality as it is, say, in Iraq, and make accommodations for it, make changes, get out, right? It took the elections in 2006 for the Bush administration to do anything, and then they kind of doubled down on the war. But the this administration, because they are so unprincipled, they're so unattached to beliefs, the idea that maybe they would reverse course on this is a possibility. However, then you have now start to talk about other factors such as the influence of Israel on this administration or on all American administrations, as well as generally the inertia that comes from the foreign policy establishment and the military industrial complex to want more, right? Want more war, want more expenditures of munitions, want more actions, etc. I guarantee you, whatever options the president is being presented to by his generals, it's all for increasing operations rather than decreasing operations.
Goodness me. I wonder whether, with the vast increase in the kind of uh, strength of the kind of military industrial complex, viewed through the kind of sheer scale of defense expenditures, I think the US still only spends about 3.4% of
Yep.
GDP on defense. Last time I checked the NATO kind of data, so but it is a massive economy, obviously, kind of biggest nominal.
Yeah, you know what? And if this is why a lot of us who look at who watch the military industrial complex don't like that GDP figure, because if you compare actual spending in inflation adjusted dollars, we spend far more money on the Pentagon than we have at any other point since the last year or two of the Second World War. So even when you go back and look at the height of the Vietnam War, where the United States about 7 or 8%, I believe, on GDP for their defense, we're still, in terms of actual expenditure of dollars measured in inflation adjusted terms, we're still spending hundreds of billions of dollars more than we were, say, in 1968, 69, when we were spending 8% or so of GDP. So it really is. But yeah, if you're going to use that metric, it is still low. But we do, the budget this year is $1 trillion for the Defense Department. That doesn't include $445 billion for veterans care, as well as then tens of billions of dollars that go into various programs outside of the Pentagon that are also essentially military or national security related. And of course, Donald Trump is proposing $1.5 trillion defense budget for FY 2027. That of course would, at $1 trillion a year, we spend more than the next 14 countries combined. I'm quite certain at $1.5 trillion a year, with maybe a couple exceptions, we'll be spending more than the rest of the world combined on our military.
Yeah, I mean, NATO as a whole takes up, last time I checked, about 54% of
Yeah,
global defense spending, and the USA accounts for two-thirds of that.
right,
And
right.
corollary is that if Europe increases to 5%, then that figure will be nudging towards two-thirds of global military
Right.
spending in NATO. But I don't get too distracted on that. I mean, it's not actually giving. I mean, because we have the same problem here in the UK. I mean, actually, our GDP percentage appears to be going down bizarrely. A shock report in the Financial Times revealed last week it's currently about
Mm.
3.3%. With plans to increase it to 3.5 by the middle of the 30s. And so on. But it's not actually giving us more troops. And
Right.
I was talking to Chaz Freeman yesterday, and he said the US doesn't have. I mean, and this is what I mean about, does the military industrial complex create the illusion of might, because you've got all this spectacularly expensive kit, which takes a long time to produced doesn't always work well and is normally late to arrive, you know, to the market. But and we've got exactly the same problem here in the UK. You don't have enough troops. We certainly don't have enough troops. Our army now is smaller than it has been since 1822, uh, believe it or not. And so, is this an illusion of might that the high tech kit? Yes, actual people, no.
Yes, Ian, I like to say I don't particularly like the comparisons to other nations, what I just, routed off about we spend more than the next 14 combined or whatever it is. Um, because I feel many other militaries around the world actually are programmed, they're budgeted for, they're funded to actually follow some type of national defense policy, right, in the interests of their country. While here in the United States, the defense budget is first and foremost for the interests of the military industrial complex. So rather than being a defense budget that's centered around a policy based upon American national security interests, it's a defense budget centered around a policy based upon the interests of corporations. And you see that it's close to 55% now of the defense budget goes right to contractors, right to the weapons companies. I mean, so you're talking about these companies, receiving more than $500 million, $500 billion this year. I mean, it's so large we can't even I can't even be accurate in how I define it because it's such a large, right number that's just impossible to really ascertain. The this budget. The idea of it, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Talk about the
But yeah.
illusion of might.
Oh, the illusion of exactly. So what you see then is you see an air force, right, that has received more money at any time in its history, but we have the least amount of planes, right? The same with the Navy. It's a Navy that receives more amount of money than any time since 1944, 1945, but we have the least amount of ships. I remember when I was a young Marine Corps officer, and I come back from Okinawa, and I got sent to the Pentagon. And when I was a kid, my uncle and dad and we took a tour of the Pentagon, and we got this little brochure, and it says how many people work there, how many miles of corridor in the Pentagon, how many cups of coffee or drink a day there, right? Because it's the world's largest office building, and so it's massive. And my mom gave me that brochure, and I actually knew, and I had just seen kind of equivalent numbers when I started working in the Pentagon. And what was fascinating to me was that when you had an American military when I was a boy that had close to, say, 3 million active duty soldiers, uh, the staff at the Pentagon was about 23,000 people. And then now, and this is going back to 2002 when the American military was about, I don't even think it was 1.5 million total, so roughly half the size. You still had 23,000 people working in the Pentagon, right? I mean, so the money's going to corporations or it's going to top heavy enterprises within the bureaucracy. I mean, I know that you could say the same for the British. You have more admirals than you have ships. I mean, I know that's one of the quips about the British Navy. I mean, and the same thing with the American Navy can be said, or the Air Force or the Marine Corps. We have hundreds and hundreds of generals and all these staffs. One of the things about that $1 trillion, it's well known we have 5 branches with the U.S. military now because we have the Space Force. But basically just attached that to say the Air Force budget. But this idea that, okay, so you would assume if you want to understand the distribution of funds with the American military budget, just divide that roughly by 4, and a quarter goes to the Army, a quarter goes to the Navy, et cetera. The reality is no, it's divided roughly in fifths because a fifth of that $1 trillion goes to the Department of Defense as its own separate entity, right? I mean, so besides the corporations, you see this money that just goes to this bureaucracy, and it's a bureaucracy that's incredibly wasteful. Many people are probably familiar with the notion or the understanding that since Ronald Reagan, so going back 40 some odd years, ordered that all federal agencies pass audits. And in that time, the Pentagon has never done it. The Pentagon was so bad off in terms of its books that it was only about 8 or 9 years ago that it was actually in the position to be audited. And then since then, of course, the last 8 or 9 attempts to audit the Pentagon, they've failed all of them. So, I mean, the idea of an illusion of might is buttressed by this understanding of how much goes to the corporations, how much of the Pentagon's budget is programmed to do that. It's purpose to be essentially what we call here in the U.S. pork, while then as well a top-heavy bureaucracy, and then as well as too this understanding that we're simply not getting what we pay for. And I think one of the best examples of that is we have this war in Iran. The media is reporting this massive buildup in the Middle East of American forces. But when you look at the amount of combat aircraft in the Middle East right now, it's only about 10 or 11% of what the U.S. had for the 1991 Gulf War, the first Iraq War. And it's only about a third of what the U.S. had in 2003 for the invasion. And we're pretty much putting everything that we have available, especially our support aircraft there. You'd say the same thing for the Navy. The fact we have 11, well, actually, we have 12 aircraft carriers right now because one's being decommissioned, the other one's being brought into service. So 10 are functional, essentially. But we only have two that are available for this conflict, right? So not only all those other things are laid out, the quality of the machinery, the vehicles, the equipment is it's the idea of getting ripped off is essentially what's happening here. Just one final point on this: when Donald Trump authorized those Tomahawk cruise missile strikes into Nigeria on Christmas Day last year, the United States fired 12 Tomahawk missiles. Four of them didn't detonate. I mean, so that's the quality of the American equipment that is actually provided to the American warfighters, right? The American service members, after it passes through this whole process of enriching the corporation, sustaining a top-heavy bureaucracy, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in the Pentagon. I was there literally shortly before 9/11. In fact, I've been to Langley, but Foggy Bottom, and various places. A huge amount of respect for military people. My dad was in the army. I've served alongside the British military in Helmand Province. As you say, and but the military is a bureaucracy. NATO is a bureaucracy, and like the EU is a bureaucracy. And this is something that few people understand. Bureaucracies develop their own life force and a need to
Yeah.
exist and have purpose. And
When I got to the Pentagon, this is a story that kind of illuminates that. When I got to the Pentagon, it was in the fall of 2002, and they were just refinishing or rebuilding the wedge. The Pentagon's dividing into five wedges, of course, right? They were just rebuilding that wedge that had been destroyed by the airplane on 9/11. And of course, there was no one working in there. And then I said to somebody, when are they gonna move everyone back in? And he said, move people back in. We've acquired more real estate. We had to move people out to other buildings. We took more land. We're not giving that up. Are you kidding me? You just don't understand what's going on here. And it's true. If you look at, say, that part of Virginia where the Pentagon is located, and if people are familiar with it, and say you're looking across the Pentagon at Washington, D.C., and if you look north of the Pentagon up to Roslyn, with all the tall buildings there have been built in the last 20, 25 years, or you look south all the way along the river down to Reagan National Airport, that entire stretch of property, probably a mile and a half long, at least 2 miles, that is the Pentagon. The Pentagon is just not simply that massive five-sided office building there. It is everything that stretches from Roslyn across from Georgetown all the way down to the Reagan Airport. Everything in between is the Pentagon. All those buildings are filled with either uniformed military, civilian government officials, or mostly contractors. Just to give you an idea of how big the footprint is, the physical plant of the Pentagon bureaucracy, it is massive.
good heavens above. I mean, the MOD sounds like a tinier version of it.
Right.
The same thing. I mean, we have our procurement travails. They stopped producing a procurement report 4 years ago because the overspending and bloat, was so much that they got so embarrassed about it they just stopped producing the figures. And waiting today, but there you have it. I mean, what prospects for the U.S. military in with the solution of might in against Iran right now. Economically tiny in comparison to the USA force, no real air force to mention, no real navy, and what there is, has been partly destroyed already in the strikes, over the past few days. But tremendous ballistic missile and drone capabilities. I mean, you mentioned 91 and 2003. But then you also had, well, 600,000 troops, I think it was in 1991,
Right.
about 350,000 in 2003. No troops this time around, and one third of the carriers. I mean, what do they hope to achieve with that?
I think again, I think the idea was it would be this Venezuela-like operation rather than kidnapping the leader. We're going to assassinate him, and then everything's going to just go smoothly from there. They're all going to sign up and work with us. That didn't work, and so now, as you were saying, they're stuck. And this idea of then a sustained campaign, I think the plan would be this roughly a week-long intensive attack, as we're seeing. Although a week-long intensive attack, as we're seeing from both the Americans and the Israelis, and then settling into a more sustained or sustainable campaign that will go for months, possibly, similar to the American campaign against Iraq from the end of the Gulf War through 2003, where the United States was bombing, or the coalition actually was bombing Iraq. I think it works out to every third or fourth day during that period of time from 1991 to 2003. So this is sustained pressure on the Iranian government, on the Iranian military, hitting key infrastructure as needed. I would expect that would be the plan presented to Donald Trump. Now, whether or not the Americans can sustain that, I think a lot of us have real serious doubts about that. Like I brought up the aircraft carrier situation, the fact that we only have two out of, again, we have 12 right now. Only two out of 12 are basically available to carry this out. We have no Marine Corps Expeditionary Unit presence in the Persian in the Middle East. The first time I've ever heard that that's happened. But this idea that we've got $1 trillion defense budget, we've got a Navy that receives more money than any time in history, we've got 175,000 Marines, but we can't have three ships with 2,000 Marines on station in the Middle East to take care of whatever type of eventualities come up, like the evacuation of an embassy or something like that. I mean, like it just really shows the superficiality or the emptiness or hollowness of the American military. And then the thing that people keep coming back to, one is the maintenance rates of aircraft and how long they can sustain these operations. American military aircraft, you're looking at most American military aircraft have availability rates between 30 and 50%. So that means if on the books there's whatever it is, 100 F-22s, only roughly 30 to 50 are going to be able to carry out missions for you on any given day. I mean, how long can you sustain that for? But then on the munitions side, which is where you see, I think, most of the commentary, we've seen the United States struggle to provide munitions for Ukraine these last 4 years. The American industry, we're not going to be using 155 howitzer rounds in Iraq, but that's an example because that was particularly the first couple years of the Ukraine war. The 155 artillery round was the topic, right? Was the discussion. And the Americans who were producing about 20,000 a month said, we're going to be producing I think they wanted to get up to over 150,000 a month was the goal within a couple years. And now 4 years after that, they're producing 35 or 40,000 artillery rounds, well short of the mark. So the ability of industry to scale up to meet the President of the United States foreign policy priority, is really demonstrated quite vividly with support for Ukraine. But we also saw it too with both the Biden and Trump administration putting the American Navy into the Red Sea to defeat the Houthis and take back control of the Red Sea. Both of those missions failed. Both those campaigns failed. And both administrations had to settle for basically a face-saving truce, which really was a retreat from the Red Sea. One of the things that really was impactful in that was that the American Navy was running out of munitions. They were running particularly out of munitions to shoot down Houthi missiles and drones. And we understand the Iranians to be orders beyond what the Houthis possess, both in capabilities and capacity. So, how long can the American Navy continue to defend its ships, let alone the defense of Israel and American bases throughout the region? I mean, this is one of the thoughts about the 12-day war, why Donald Trump ends it by having this theater of the B-2s coming in to obliterate the nuclear program or whatever they claim, was because both the Americans and the Israelis were running out of the missiles needed to shoot down Iranian missiles. And this is not a new problem. This is something we saw 10 years ago in Syria and Iraq as the American Air Force and Navy were conducting an air campaign against the Islamic State. In 2015, 2016, a Central Command, the command for the American headquarters for the Middle East, ran out of munitions. They had to send munitions from other parts of the world to supply Central Command as they're fighting the Islamic State, which was what, 25, 30,000 combatants maybe? Iran, we're talking about a nation of 92 million people. If 10 years ago we couldn't sustain air operations against the Islamic State, how are we going to sustain operations against the Islamic Republic of Iran? I mean, so I think there are a lot of questions where many of us are looking at in a sense of that if they are serious about carrying out this campaign for months, Donald Trump, we've heard kind of 4 weeks is the term they said now, but at the end of 4 weeks, where are they going to be at? So they're going to have to do something to save face in all of this. But the idea of achieving any of the objectives, whatever those objectives may truly be, seems really unlikely.
Yeah, I can't help but agree, and of course, it also shows the kind of tyranny of linear thinking. I mean, the military phrase, no plan survives contact with the enemy. I
Right.
mean, your plan is you apply a certain number of inputs, to a problem. You apply a certain amount of force to that problem, and on paper that produces the following results. But that doesn't actually kind of predict how the adversary will respond.
Right.
Uh, and if you don't really understand the adversary very well anyway, because not just in the US but in the UK we've disinvested in diplomacy and understanding, people in other countries, then you can't control, the forces that they unleash and the tactics and the strategy that they deploy. And very clearly, Iran's strategy here is to cause chaos in the global economy,
Mhm.
radicalize Gulf states against the US. It is not necessarily to kind of take on the US head on because there's such a variation in forces that's kind of an odd concept. Anyway, they're seeking to kind of crash the global economy and radicalize the Middle East against the US. So for them, and the same could be applied to the Ukraine war. We're thinking in very tactical terms, and actually, arguably, the Iranians are being more strategic in how they're responding.
Right, and we've seen in Iran that I would argue, same for Russia, prepared for a war for quite some time. I think the Iranians especially prepared for this for better part of 40 years. This idea that at some point this hostility between the United States will become existential for us. And we've seen conflict between the U.S. and Iran throughout the last 45 years. I mean, the Iraq-Iran war was essentially a proxy war against Iran by the U.S. via Iraq. That certainly was existential. But the notion that you mentioned before that, most of Iran's navy has probably been destroyed at this point or whatever, the Iranians are fine with it. I mean, nobody wants to see their boats blown up, but they weren't intending to use those boats for anything anyway. That's, the idea of fighting the Americans symmetrically. You're going to sail your frigates out and you're going to have a gun battle like it's World War II, simply not the case. So they're going to fight asymmetrically, something they prepared for. They understand the American and the Israeli weaknesses. And more importantly, as you said, Ian, the strategy hinges upon forcing others to put pressure on the Americans to stop this, right? So, including the American public, if we'll see if this continues. The cost of gasoline here in the United States. I mean, the United States is an incredibly oil dependent country. I mean, it doesn't matter that we're a net exporter when we produce more oil and gas than anyone else in the world or anything like that. We are so oil dependent because of our transportation system that we have no buffer on this, that there is going to be no cushion for us. And of course, the idea that the oil market and the gas market is a global market. And so, I think many Americans think that ExxonMobil is not going to sell their oil overseas. That the Chinese, if they stop, the Chinese get, I think it's 11 or 12 million barrels a day through the Straits of Hormuz. That the Exxon won't sell to the Chinese if the Chinese are offering more money. I mean, just that's not how it works. So, I think that understanding of how the Iranians are viewing this, understanding Iran's view or planning for the balances in here, what's symmetric, what's asymmetric, and their ability to prepare that over the last decades. And we'll see. I mean, particularly, we'll see what Iran has learned from the 12-day war. We see indications that they are firing their missiles in a manner different than they did in the 12-day war. That in the 12-day war, there are these mass volleys of 50 or 60 missiles at a time. And now it doesn't appear that that's the way they're firing off their missiles. I mean, so Iran's understanding of how the Americans fight, I don't know if the Americans have reciprocated that. And so, this idea that Iran is in a position to yeah, I think you can make the argument. This is the argument I've had for years with Russia and Ukraine, that war is a war that Russia can't lose, Ukraine can't win, and I think you may be able to make that articulation about this conflict, this war as well. That this being a war that the United States can't win and Iran can't lose.
Mm.
You're right. I mean, so then what do you do? How do you get out of it? Which goes back to your original question, which I think is very pressing. And I'm very concerned that as we have hearings throughout Washington, D.C. and Congress this week, and the various administration officials are coming into Congress to explain what they're doing, the focus seems to be from United States Congress as to the justification for this, as opposed to the exit from this. I've not heard, I don't think any American members of Congress, and then certainly very few media figures who've expressed the dilemma that you did, Ian. And I think that's the most pressing thing right now. How does the United States get out of this, regardless of what you think of Donald Trump or what you think of Iran or what you think about any of it? Okay, how does this end?
Yeah, exactly. And I think lots of people have played up the fact that Russia hasn't really rushed to Iran's aid. But I think if the Iranians have got anything from Russia, it's kind of strategy and
Yeah.
how to think about this, because very clearly in the context of the Ukraine war, for the Europeans, certainly for the Ukrainians, this is a purely military conflict. You could say for the Ukrainians, it's kind of partly civilizational too. It's certainly existential in some respects in terms of them as a kind of nation state. But the dynamic of how they think about strategy is kind of very military in its focus. Whereas the dynamic of how the Russians think about it is political and economic in its orientation. And they don't really see the war, as far as I can gather, in terms of military conquest, despite people saying they're going to invade Poland next, which is
Yeah.
complete nonsense, by the way. This is about bleeding Europe dry economically and sowing such political chaos within the European Union that it causes pressure on the union to explode. I mean, Ukraine is just a theatre for that. Yes, they want to stop NATO expansion, but it looks like they could have done the job on that as well. So I think if the Iranians have learned anything, what I see in this conflict now is that same kind of strategic thinking about actually, what their aims are, and quite clearly they have much more focused and much more strategic aims than the US right now. And Israel, of course. I'm sad to say.
Yeah, and from when I got up this morning, I opened my phone and I opened up my app, my news app on my phone, and the lead story was a story from The Guardian, and the headline was about the Israeli army going into Lebanon and drones striking the U.S. embassy in Riyadh. It wasn't about Iran, right? It wasn't about Israel. I mean, so we're on day 4 here, and the lead headline on my news aggregator is about war outside of Israel and Iran. So this idea that the Iranians have been able to rather quickly expand this war into a regional war, it gets to your point about their strategy here. And then I really appreciate your articulation there, Ian, of this idea of the Russian view of the war based upon political and economic goals, or using political and economic inputs as much as military to achieve their objectives. Because I think. And this is a problem we have in the United States. You have American leadership that has no conceptions, say, of the levels of warfare. They have no understanding of tactical, operational, strategic, and political, and how political is dominant in political. I mean, a lot of times you'll see in the American military, when they talk about the levels of warfare, they will leave out that upper echelon of political, because it just they don't want to have to consider that everything is subordinate to the political. And so when you see the way the American military is carrying out this campaign, American leadership is talking about it, American media is reporting on it, it is a resuscitation of X amount of drones fired, X amount of missiles fired, these cities in Iran hit, this bombed. I mean, just a tactical resuscitation of the daily numbers, essentially a body count, if you will, without any type of context of what is the political ramifications here. Because ultimately, the objectives are purely political. Especially you're talking about regime change. I mean, you can't get more political than that. But even all the other objectives, if you believe them, about ending the nuclear program in its entirety, stopping ballistic missile production, not having an alliance with the Hezbollah or the Houthis or whoever. I mean, that is all, that is all political. And the discussion seems to just pass right over that, and just continually falls back into tactical considerations. Again, that drumbeat, that daily reporting, the resuscitation of, how many cities were hit, how many missiles were fired, et cetera.
Yeah, I was talking to Professor Robert Pape of University of Chicago the other day, and he expresses this perfectly in his book, "Bombing to Win." That
Mhm.
it never works. It just
Right.
because people focus laser-like on the munitions, on the strikes, on the position, and on the kind of the pure metrics, and not the kind of wider factors at play. Matthew, that's been fantastically informative, and it was great to actually talk to you properly for the first time. Hope we can do this. Again, it all comes back to, is it madman theory or just a madman? The
Right.
White
Right.
House. I think I
Right.
think I think you've captured the title of this video, perfectly. Thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate you taking the time. I really value your thoughts and your opinions, and I commend you on your service to your country as a military officer back in the day. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Wherever you are in the world, whatever your nationality or religion, I wish you very much peace. Matthew Ho, my good friend, let's do this again. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ian. Anytime. Anytime. And thanks for what you're doing.